Kofi Mensah had only been in Texas for 9 months, but every day felt like a quiet test. The town was clean, polite, and proud. The kind of place where flags flew year-round, small businesses stayed in families, and new faces, even friendly ones, were watched before they were welcomed. He had come with hope in his chest and credentials in his folder, but neither mattered as much as the way he spoke. His first job in America wasn't what he'd dreamed of. Dalton Auto Works sat on the edge of town, a large, dusty garage with a reputation for honest work and good prices. Kofi found the listing through a community board and got hired within a week. No background checks, no questions. Just a handshake from Rick Dalton and a hard look that said, "Don't ask for much." Rick was loud, always had a toothpick in his mouth, and a MAGA hat on his desk, even though the election had been over for years. He called himself a no-nonsense kind of guy, which really meant he got to decide what nonsense was. Kofi had worked there for 4 months now. He kept his head down, learned the routines, fixed everything from busted radiators to leaking brake lines. He rarely spoke unless it was necessary, not because he lacked words, but because every time he opened his mouth, people heard something different. It was during a Friday morning staff meeting that the line got crossed. The 5 of them stood in the break room, grease on their shirts, coffee in paper cups, the radio playing classic rock low in the background. Rick leaned against the filing cabinet, updating them on upcoming repairs. When he mentioned the new client, some lawyer with a Tesla needing diagnostics, Kofi spoke up. "We'll need to isolate the fault history through the inverter logs. The error code might not show up through a basic scan." Everyone turned. Rick squinted. "What was that, Kofi?" Kofi repeated it, slower. "The issue won't register through standard diagnostics. We'll need to check the inverter log." Rick laughed. Then in front of everyone, he scrunched his face, put on a thick, exaggerated African accent, and said, "We will need to check the logs." The room froze. Then came the awkward chuckles. Not loud, but enough. Kofi stood still, the smile on his face polite but frozen in place. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Rick clapped him on the shoulder. "Relax, buddy, I'm just playing. You're too smart for me anyway." The laughter died quickly. The meeting moved on, but something inside Kofi shifted. He stood there, the coffee in his hand untouched, his mind 1,000 miles away. Not back home. Not in the shop, but in the future. A future where men like Rick didn't get to laugh at men like him. He didn't show anger, didn't snap back. But in the silence that followed, Kofi made a promise to himself. "One day, I will not be laughed at. In rooms like this, I will own them." Kofi Mensah had only been in Texas for 9 months, but every day felt like a quiet test. The town was clean, polite, and proud. The kind of place where flags flew year-round, small businesses stayed in families, and new faces, even friendly ones, were watched before they were welcomed. He had come with hope in his chest and credentials in his folder, but neither mattered as much as the way he spoke. His first job in America wasn't what he'd dreamed of. Dalton Auto Works sat on the edge of town, a large, dusty garage with a reputation for honest work and good prices. Kofi found the listing through a community board and got hired within a week. No background checks, no questions, just a handshake from Rick Dalton and a hard look that said, "Don't ask for much." Rick was loud, always had a toothpick in his mouth and a MAGA hat on his desk, even though the election had been over for years. He called himself a no-nonsense kind of guy, which really meant he got to decide what nonsense was. Kofi had worked there for 4 months now. He kept his head down, learned the routines, fixed everything from busted radiators to leaking brake lines. He rarely spoke unless it was necessary, not because he lacked words, but because every time he opened his mouth, people heard something different. It was during a Friday morning staff meeting that the line got crossed. The 5 of them stood in the break room, grease on their shirts, coffee in paper cups, the radio playing classic rock low in the background. Rick leaned against the filing cabinet, updating them on upcoming repairs. When he mentioned the new client, some lawyer with a Tesla needing diagnostics. Kofi spoke up. We'll need to isolate the fault history through the inverter logs. The error code might not show up through a basic scan. Everyone turned. Rick squinted. What was that, Kofi? Kofi repeated it, slower. The issue won't register through standard diagnostics. We'll need to check the inverter log. Rick. Then, in front of everyone, he scrunched his face, put on a thick, exaggerated African accent, and said, We will need to check the logs. The room froze. Then came the awkward chuckles. Not loud, but enough. Kofi stood still. The smile on his face polite but frozen in place. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Rick clapped him on the shoulder. Relax, buddy. I'm just playing. You're too smart for me anyway. The laughter died quickly. The meeting moved on. But something inside Kofi shifted. He stood there, the coffee in his hand untouched, his mind 1,000 miles away. Not back home. Not in the shop, but in the future. A future where men like Rick didn't get to laugh at men like him. He didn't show anger, didn't snap back. But in the silence that followed, Kofi made a promise to himself. One day, I will not be laughed at. In rooms like this, I will own them. That night, the quiet inside his apartment felt heavier than usual. A studio above a laundromat with a single window that overlooked the back alley, filled with dumpsters and buzzing wires. He poured himself a cup of tea, the way his mother used to make it. Strong, no sugar. He sat at the small table staring at his work boots still covered in dust. He thought about the degree in mechanical engineering that sat folded in a drawer, thought about the emails he sent, dozens of them, to companies that never replied, thought about the visa process, the application delays, the years of sacrifice. And now he was here, in a garage run by a man who barely looked him in the eye, a man who mimicked his accent and called it a joke. The pain wasn't just in what Rick said, it was in how everyone else reacted. No one said a word. No one stopped it. They laughed to avoid being the target next. Kofi knew that kind of laughter. It wasn't new. He remembered being 7 years old, back in Accra, when a teacher told him he was too quiet to be a leader. His mother had corrected her that same day. Silence is not weakness, she had said. Sometimes silence is dignity. He held on to that for years. But today, that silence burned. He stared at the steam rising from his tea, and something settled. In his chest, not rage, not bitterness, clarity. He reached for the old notebook on the counter and flipped to the back page. It was filled with lists, things he wanted to learn, tools he hoped to own one day, ideas for a shop of his own. One line written months ago in faded ink stood out. Build something they can't ignore. He underlined it, twice. The next morning, nothing changed on the outside. Kofi showed up on time. He wore the same uniform. He fixed 3 cars, checked 2 engines, helped a customer who was stranded in the parking lot. Rick still grunted instructions and barked across the garage like he was the king of something. But Kofi was different. His hands moved with focus, his posture straighter, his silence no longer uncertain. It was intentional. By lunchtime, he had started watching closely, not just the cars, but the business itself. The way Rick handled the books, the way inventory was tracked, the customers, who left frustrated when service was delayed or incomplete. He saw holes in the system. He saw opportunity. By evening, Kofi sat in his apartment with a borrowed laptop from a church friend and opened a browser tab. He typed, "How to start an auto. Repair business in Texas." Monday mornings at Dalton Auto Works were always the busiest. Engines coughed awake, tires squealed on wet pavement, and the phones rang before the lights were even on. Kofi had learned to navigate the chaos with practiced calm. He stayed on task, stayed quiet, stayed focused. But this morning was different. The silver Mercedes that pulled up didn't belong to the usual clientele. It gleamed. Flawless paint, custom wheels, luxury humming beneath its hood. A tall man in a crisp navy suit stepped out and looked around like he was expecting disappointment. Kofi dried his hands on a rag and approached, offering a respectful, Nod. Good morning, sir. What can I help you with today? The man barely glanced at him. I'd prefer to speak with someone who works here. Kofi blinked. Sir, I do work here. The man narrowed his eyes. No offense, but I need a real technician, someone who actually knows these systems. Before Kofi could reply, Rick appeared from the office, sipping his coffee like a sheriff arriving to keep the peace. Morning, Mr. Langston, he called, wide grin on his face. Don't mind him. He's still learning how we do things in America. The words hit Kofi like a slap. Langston smiled, suddenly at ease. I figured. Rick waved Kofi off with a flick of his fingers. Why don't you go check the parts shipment in the back? Kofi hesitated. His throat was tight. He felt the pressure behind his eyes, the sting behind his ribs. But he nodded once and turned away. In the back room, surrounded by crates and oil filters, he stood for a moment gripping the edge of a shelf, knuckles white. He didn't cry, he didn't scream. He just stood there, letting the silence cool his anger. Later that afternoon, while grabbing a wrench from the tool bench, he overheard two mechanics talking. Their voices were low, but the walls were thin. Rick said Kofi talks like Google. Translate, I nearly choked on my sandwich. Laughter. He's smart, though, probably smarter than all of us. Yeah, but who's gonna take orders from a guy who sounds like Siri with a stutter? More laughter. Kofi didn't step in. He didn't say a word. He just walked away, each footstep heavier than the last. That night he sat on his mattress with the lights off. No TV, no music. Just the sound of his breathing and the hum of the old fridge across the room. He thought about going home. He thought about how hard his parents worked to get him that plane ticket. About the degree in mechanical engineering hanging on his mother's wall, framed with pride. About the night before he left Ghana, when his mother pressed her hands to his chest and said, "Even if they don't see your light, don't let them dim it." He repeated her words out loud now, just to hear something. That didn't hurt. The next day, things got worse. Kofi had spent the morning organizing the workflow board, color-coding urgent repairs, labeling customer keys, optimizing the order to reduce downtime. When Rick walked in and saw it, he raised an eyebrow. "What's all this?" he asked, wiping his hands on a towel. Kofi explained the new system in clear, practical terms. It saves about 2 hours a day and makes the queue easier to track. Rick leaned back and barked a laugh. "Well, look at you, reorganizing the place like it's some African jungle startup." The other workers went still. One let out a nervous laugh that died as quickly as it started. Rick kept going. "Maybe. Next you'll tell me how to run my own shop, huh?" Kofi didn't reply. He just stood there, jaw tight, fingers curled around the marker in his hand. Rick stepped closer. "You got ideas, Kofi, I'll give you that. But you leave the thinking to us, all right? You just keep fixing the cars." The moment passed, and the air returned to motion. But something inside Kofi didn't. He returned to the back room and leaned against the wall. His chest rose and fell like a man coming up for air after sinking too deep. He thought about the man in the Mercedes. He thought about Rick's words. He thought about every nod, every grin, every joke passed off as harmless. They didn't see his intelligence. They didn't see his degree. They didn't see his humanity. Only his accent. Only his silence. Only what they wanted to see. The sun dipped behind the shop's roof as Kofi sat in the locker room, elbows on his knees, hands folded tightly. His uniform clung to him, damp from the Texas heat and the weight of the day. Outside, tools clanged, cars revved, and Rick's voice rang through the garage like it always did, loud, certain, unchecked. But in this moment, none of it mattered. The sting wasn't just the words. It was the silence that followed, the way no one stood beside him, the way the laughter of others made him feel like he was shrinking in plain sight. He thought about writing to his uncle back home, maybe asking if there was work in Accra, maybe admitting this wasn't what he expected. But what would he say? They laugh at my accent. That wasn't something you could translate without it sounding small, but it wasn't small, it was soul deep. Later that night, Kofi stood barefoot in the middle of his kitchen, warming. leftovers in the microwave. As the seconds ticked down, he stared at the taped photo on his refrigerator. Him and his mother standing in front of Kotoka Airport, the day he left Ghana. She had been crying, but smiling. Her last words still echoed in his memory. "Go, and shine so brightly they can't ignore you." He whispered the line aloud now, voice cracking. But how do you shine when people keep turning off the light? The next day, he returned to the shop as usual. He didn't want to. His feet dragged, his chest felt heavy. But he showed up, because that's what he'd always done. Rick didn't speak to him that morning, just handed him a clipboard and walked away. By mid-afternoon, a customer came in, an elderly woman with a bad radiator leak and a confused look on her face. Kofi approached calmly, spoke gently, explained the issue with diagrams and a kind smile. She thanked him profusely, said she hadn't been treated that kindly in a long time. Rick watched the interaction from the office window but said nothing. Later, while grabbing parts from the supply room, Kofi heard Rick talking to another employee. "He's good with the old ladies," Rick said, laughing. "Just don't let him rewire the place, might end up fixing it with jungle vines." That night, Kofi didn't go home right away. He walked. No destination, just needed to move. The town lights flickered as people closed up shops and waved at one another. He passed a bookstore, then a barber shop, then a shuttered dry cleaner. And then he saw it, an empty garage unit for rent. The windows were dusty, the paint peeling, but the shape of it reminded him of something, possibility. He walked up to the glass, cupped his hands against the window, and looked inside. Empty. Cracked floor. Worn walls. But in his mind he saw lift machines, toolboxes, a desk with a laptop and a hand-drawn logo on the door. His name above it all, not just to prove something to them, but to reclaim something for himself. He stood there for several minutes, then turned and walked home, slower now, but more certain. The next morning, Rick called for a team meeting. Everyone circled around the lift bay. He waved a sheet of paper in his hand. "We've got a new software update for diagnostics," he said. "Real fancy stuff. I'm not going to pretend to understand it. That's Kofi's thing. Maybe he can give us a lesson in African engineering." The others looked at their feet. Kofi's eyes met Rick's. For the first time, he didn't look away. Spoke, steady and clear. "The system integrates better with Tesla and hybrid diagnostics. If we're not running updates, we'll fall behind." Rick smirked. "You planning on taking over now?" "No," Kofi replied calmly. "Just making sure we don't stay stuck." The smirk faltered. After the meeting, one of the younger mechanics, Javier, approached him quietly. "Hey man, that was cool. Just wanted to say I see what you're doing. It matters." Kofi nodded. "Thanks. It was small, but it was something." That night, he made two decisions. First, he would return to the empty garage and write down the number on the for rent sign. Second, he would stop apologizing for the way he spoke, because his accent wasn't a mistake. It was a map of where he came from, and now it would guide where he was going. The days that followed moved in slow motion. Kofi still showed up early, still wore his name patch with quiet pride, still wiped grease from his knuckles before shaking a customer's hand. On the surface, nothing had changed, but inside, everything had. He barely spoke now, just nods, just short answers. He stopped suggesting ideas, stopped staying late to organize the inventory or fine-tune the diagnostics logs. There was no point. No one wanted his thoughts, they only wanted his hands. And even then, not all the time. One afternoon, while replacing brake pads on a rusted pickup, he overheard Rick talking to a supplier on the phone. "Yeah, we've got a guy, real hard worker, foreign fella. Can't understand half of what he says, but he gets the job done. Cheap, too." Kofi paused, socket wrench midair. He didn't flinch, just listened. He was no longer surprised. That night, he returned to his apartment and sat in silence for over an hour, staring at the blinking cursor on a blank job application. He'd already sent out 15 others, some to big garages, some to car dealerships, even one to an engineering firm 3 towns over. No one replied. Some messages bounced back, others were marked as read, but never followed up. It didn't take long to realize his resume might be full, but his accent erased half of it. Still, he filled out the application, hit send, and waited. The waiting became its own kind of ache. He thought about calling his old professor back in Ghana, asking if there were job opportunities back home. Thought about asking his friend Malik in Toronto if he could crash on his couch for a few months. Canada, maybe, would be different. But each time the phone was in his hand, he stopped himself, because something inside him refused to give up. Not yet. He picked up his phone and called his sister instead. The call rang twice before she answered. Breathless and cheerful, Kofi. "You never call this early. How are you?" He hesitated. "I'm well, Akosua, just finished work." "How's everything there? Are they treating you okay?" "They are," he lied gently. "The work is long, but good." She sighed with relief. "Mama says she prays for you every night. Baba keeps telling everyone his son is in America, building cars like a king." Kofi laughed softly. "Tell them I miss them." They talked for a few more minutes. She asked about the weather. He asked about her university classes. Neither mentioned how hard it was to afford those classes without his remittances. But they both knew. After he hung up, the silence returned, this time heavier. He sat back, the edges of his eyes wet, heart pounding with something too complicated to name. Was this what he left everything for? That night, while looking for his passport in a drawer, he found it. A small, leather-bound journal. The corners were worn. The spine cracked. He had brought it with him on the flight from Accra, packed between socks and ambition. He opened it slowly. Inside were pages filled with his handwriting. Dreams, reminders, small diagrams of engines he'd designed in school. He flipped to the last written page. At the top, underlined 3 times, "My future goals." Below it, a list. "Open my own business, employ others, be respected. Take care of Mama, never forget who I am." He stared at the first line for a long time, then picked up a pen and circled it, once, twice, 3 times. The next morning, nothing had changed at the shop. Rick barked orders. Customers came and went. Javier handed him a new work order without making eye contact. But something had changed in Kofi. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defeated. He was planning. That night, with his dinner untouched on the counter, he opened his laptop. It was old, the screen cracked at the corner, the charger held together with tape. But it worked. He typed, "How to start a small auto repair business in Texas." The search results came quickly. Licensing, insurance, shop space, LLC registration. He wrote everything down in the back of the journal. No one knew what he was doing. Not Rick, not his co-workers, not even his sister. But in the quiet of that room, far from home and everything he used to know, Kofi was planting a seed. A slow, deliberate beginning, one built not on anger, but on purpose. Over the next several nights, Kofi stayed up long after the rest of the town had gone to sleep. He read articles about permits, loans, and equipment. He watched videos of other immigrants who had started with nothing and built something they could pass on. He bookmarked pages on business tax codes and OSHA safety guidelines. Every hour he spent researching was another hour not wasted in silence. During the day, he still did his job, still fixed engines, still nodded politely when spoken to. But his silence was different now. Before, it had been self-protection. Now, it was strategy. He began noticing things Rick never paid attention to: the missed calls, the unpaid invoices, the customers who stopped coming back. Rick dismissed them as flaky or cheap. But Kofi saw something else. Opportunity. He wrote down every lesson the garage taught him, what not to do, what he would do better. In the evenings, he traced outlines of what his own garage would look like, not big, just clean, honest. Somewhere people like him felt respected when they walked through the door. By the 3rd week, he had a name: Mensa Auto Solutions. It sounded small, quiet, but real. He even designed a logo, hand-sketched with a pencil on the back of a utility bill envelope. One night after a long shift, he sat on his mattress with his laptop balanced on his knees. He opened a new browser tab and searched local garage spaces for lease. Most were too expensive. Some were too far away. But one listing caught his eye. A former auto shop in a forgotten strip on the edge of town. The Tew. Read old but solid. Needs work, low rent, will consider all offers. Kofi stared at the photo. A dusty single-bay unit with cracked windows and weeds growing near the door. It looked like nothing. But to him, it looked like freedom. He saved the listing. The next day, he stopped by the address on his way home from work. The place was worse than the pictures. The roof sagged slightly. The lock on the door was rusted. A broken sign above the entrance barely clung to the screws that held it. But he could see it. His logo above the door. A fresh coat of paint. His name, not Rick's, on the invoices. He stood there for nearly 10 minutes, just breathing it in. Later that night, he called the number on the listing. A tired voice answered. "Yeah, it's still open. You got cash?" "I'm not dealing with banks." Kofi nodded, though the man couldn't see him. "I'll figure it out." He hung up and just sat there. He didn't have the money. Not yet. But he had something Rick never taught him how to use. Hope. The next weekend, he called his sister again. Her voice, bright as always, lifted his spirit like sunlight through clouds. "Akosua," he said slowly. "I need to ask you something. And I need you not to worry." She went quiet. "Okay. I want to open a business here, a small garage," she gasped. "That's amazing." "It's only an idea," he said. "But I need you to help me talk to Mama and Baba. If I can hold off sending money this month, just one time, I can use it to apply for a lease." There was a pause. A long one. He waited, bracing for guilt or disappointment. But instead, she said, "You've been feeding us since you left, Kofi. Maybe it's time we help you plant your seed." He choked back the emotion in his throat. "Thank you." That night, he took out his journal and wrote a single sentence beneath his old goals. "This is how change begins." The next morning at Dalton Auto Works, Rick was in a particularly loud mood, shouting at the supplier, complaining about missed deliveries, blaming everyone but himself. Kofi said nothing. He kept his head down, but inside, something had changed. He was no longer waiting to be seen. He was building something so big, they'd have no choice but to see it. During lunch, he stepped outside with a peanut butter sandwich and sat on the curb. Javier walked past, then doubled back and sat beside him. "You okay?" Javier asked. Kofi looked over. "Why do you ask?" "You're different lately." Kofi gave a small smile. "Maybe I just stopped hoping they'd notice." Javier nodded slowly. "You thinking about leaving?" Kofi didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked, "If you had one shot to build something that belonged only to you, would you take it?" Javier smiled. "In a heartbeat." Kofi nodded. "Me, too." He stood, dusted off his pants, and walked back into the garage. As he passed Rick's office, he heard laughter again. But it didn't stick to his skin this time. He had peeled off that layer. He had work to do, and this time, it was for himself. Summer heat thickened as the week dragged on, making the garage feel more like a furnace than a workplace. The air conditioning hadn't worked in months, and Rick kept promising he'd get to it eventually, but everyone knew that meant never. It was late afternoon when she pulled in. A black sedan with New York plates, engine sputtering, the unmistakable smell of burned transmission fluid trailing behind it. Kofi had just finished wrapping up a tire rotation and barely wiped his hands when Rick called out across the bay, "Hey, Mensa, lady's got trouble, show her what you Africans can do." He said it with a laugh like it was funny. Kofi didn't respond, just nodded and walked toward the car. The woman stepped out, dressed in a fitted blue suit, her hair tied back neatly. She looked around, fanning herself with a folder. Kofi approached calmly. "Good afternoon, I'm Kofi. What seems to be the issue?" She looked him over, eyes scanning his name patch, then nodded. "It's overheating. Something's off with the transmission. I'm not sure what. I'm just passing through for work. I can take a look." She followed him around to the hood. watching as he moved with focus and care, wiping the dipstick, checking the coolant, listening to the idle. Within 10 minutes, he had a clear picture. It's the fluid. The transmission's leaking and the pump isn't cycling properly. You'll need a reseal. I can patch it for now so you can get to a better shop when you're out of town. She raised an eyebrow. And you figured all that out without plugging it into one of those fancy diagnostic computers? Kofi smiled faintly. Sometimes experience is faster, she chuckled. Impressive. He gave her a small nod, then began the work. 45 minutes later, he handed her the keys. Good to go, for now. But get it seen before the end of the week. She paused before opening the car door. Why are you working here? She asked, her tone direct but not unkind. Kofi looked up, surprised. Excuse me? You clearly know your stuff. This place. She glanced around the cluttered garage, the sagging ceiling tiles, the cracked floor. Doesn't deserve you. Kofi hesitated, unsure if she meant it as a compliment or an insult. I'm just trying to keep going, he said carefully. She nodded slowly, then reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. Vanessa Liu, accountant, independent consultant. If you ever want to talk about starting something of your own, call me. She handed him the card and got into the car. Kofi stared after her as she pulled away, the sound of her tires fading into the distance. That night, he placed the card on the table beside his journal and stared at it like it might catch fire. The next day, he called. She picked up on the second ring. I was hoping you would, she said. They met later that week at a local cafe. Neutral ground, quiet atmosphere. Kofi wore his best shirt, the one without oil stains. Vanessa had a folder with sticky notes already marked. I wasn't kidding, she said as they sat down. You've got skill. I work with numbers, and I've helped 3 small businesses get off the ground in the last year. I don't have the money, Kofi said quickly, almost apologetically. I didn't ask if you had money, she replied. I asked if you had a vision. Kofi swallowed. I do. I never thought anyone would believe in it. Vanessa smiled. Then it's time someone did. They talked for hours. She explained the basics, how to register a business, how to build a budget, what banks looked for in small loans. Kofi listened, taking notes in the margins of his journal. That night, he stayed up past midnight filing paperwork. By the end of the week, Mensa Auto Solutions was officially registered with the state. He stared at the email confirmation like it was a letter from the future. At the garage, Rick started to notice the change. Kofi wasn't as talkative, but he was focused, more precise. He turned down extra hours, worked only his shift. He spent breaks on his phone, not laughing at anyone's jokes. There was a stillness in him now, the kind that made other people uncomfortable. One afternoon, Rick approached him. Hey, he said, what's with the attitude lately? No attitude, Kofi replied without looking up. Rick leaned in. You've been walking around here like you're better than us. Kofi looked him in the eye. I'm just walking different. That's all. Rick's voice dropped lower. Let me give you some advice, Mensa. You're not going to get very far talking the way you do. Behind them, someone cleared their throat. Vanessa. She had walked in unnoticed, holding a small folder in her hand. Maybe the problem isn't his accent, she said calmly. Maybe it's your hearing. Rick blinked, thrown off. Who the hell are you? A friend, she said simply, and someone who knows what respect sounds like. Rick turned away with a grunt, pretending he didn't hear her. Kofi watched. Her approach. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. Yes, I did, she replied. Because the world changes when people stop pretending they don't hear. The next few days passed like a blur. Kofi continued his shifts as usual, but now there was an extra rhythm in his steps. Each movement held more purpose. His silence, once defensive, now held weight. Like a man walking towards something only he could see. On his lunch breaks, he and Vanessa began meeting in the public library. She helped him build a basic business plan, walking him through the financial projections line by line. "This looks tight," she warned one day, circling the margins. "You're going to have to do everything yourself at first. Repairs, paperwork, cleaning, client calls." "I already do," Kofi replied with a smile. He borrowed a second-hand laptop from a church donation bin and spent his evenings drafting emails, researching low-cost tools, and creating a spreadsheet of auto parts vendors. He reached out to 2 old friends from Ghana, both mechanics, just to share the idea. Both of them responded the same way. "Do it, brother. If not you, who?" Late one night, he returned to the garage he'd found weeks earlier. The dusty, half-abandoned unit on the edge of town. This time, he brought a flashlight, a notepad, and tape measure. He walked the space slowly, measuring dimensions, tapping the walls, checking the corners. It was far from perfect. There were cracks in the ceiling, the garage door stuck halfway. The wiring would need to be redone, but it was his size. Not in square feet. In spirit, he could breathe here. He could build here. The next morning, he met the landlord, an older man named Carl who wore overalls and smelled faintly of chewing tobacco. They sat on milk crates near the door. "You got any money?" Carl asked bluntly. "Enough to start," Kofi said honestly. Carl studied him for a moment. "Most folks quit by month 3. You planning to be different?" "I've already been different my whole life," Kofi replied. Carl let out a half chuckle. "All right then, I'll give you the first month at half price. You show me you're serious, and we'll talk about extending the lease." Kofi stood and shook his hand. And that was it. He had a space, not much, not glamorous, not ready, but his. He stood outside the garage as Carl drove off, the keys cold in his palm. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled like rust and old paint. The windows let in strips of fading light. He walked to the center of the space, crouched down, and ran his fingers over the concrete. Then he stood up and whispered, "Mensa Auto Solutions." And just like that, the name existed beyond paper. Back at Dalton Auto Works, Rick started getting suspicious. He'd noticed Kofi showing up exactly on time, not a minute early, never staying late. He saw the way Kofi turned down side work and skipped the small talk. One afternoon, he approached him while he was cleaning up the engine bay of a Subaru. "You seeing other shops behind my back?" Rick asked, trying to sound casual. Kofi didn't look up. "No. You starting something?" Kofi paused. "I'm finishing something." Rick scowled. "You think you're better than this place?" Kofi wiped his hands clean and turned to him. "I think I'm better than being mocked and underpaid for skills you don't understand." Rick barked a laugh. "You'll come crawling back in 3 months." Kofi said nothing. He didn't need to. A week later, on his final day at Dalton, he arrived early. Not to work, but to return his uniform. He walked through the garage, placed the shirt on the office chair, and left a sealed envelope on Rick's desk. On inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for showing me everything I never want to become." No signature, no goodbye. He walked out of Dalton Auto Works with nothing but his phone, his journal, and his keys. Later that night, he unlocked his new garage and turned on the single overhead light. It flickered to life, bathing the room in warm, imperfect glow. Vanessa arrived an hour later with coffee and a folding chair. "You really did it," she said, stepping inside and looking around. "I did," Kofi replied. "Now comes the hard part." She handed him the cup. "You've already done the hardest part, believing it could happen." He looked around at the empty space, at the crack in the floor, at the echo of his own heartbeat bouncing off the walls. And for the first time in a long time, he felt full, not of fear, but of fire. He walked to the back of the garage, pulled out a brush and a can of white paint, and drew the first line of his logo across the far wall. No fanfare, no applause, just a man reclaiming his voice, one stroke at a time. The morning Mensa Auto Solutions opened its doors. Kofi didn't expect a line. There was no ribbon to cut, no ceremony, just an open sign hung slightly crooked, and a small stack of flyers he printed at the library. The garage still smelled faintly of mildew, and the paint job was a rushed 2-coat special from a discount hardware store. But the lift worked, The tools were clean, and for the first time in his life, the name on the wall was his. He spent most of the first week fixing neighborhood cars, brake pads, oil changes, a muffler on a 2006 Camry that rattled like it was coughing. Business was slow but steady, enough to keep the lights on and the fridge at home stocked. On the 8th day, a woman pulled in with a dusty 1967 Mustang. She stepped out, looked around the space, and said she was referred by someone named Vanessa Liu. She said you could do things most mechanics wouldn't even attempt, the woman said. My brother tried to restore it, made it worse. I need someone who actually cares. Kofi nodded, examined the car, and asked if he could take a few hours with it. 3 hours later, he'd diagnosed 2 misfittings, realigned the carburetor, and cleaned up the ignition coil. She returned, stunned. I had 3 people turn me down. One of them said it wasn't worth the trouble. Kofi shrugged. Everything's worth the trouble if it means something to someone. She asked if she could take a picture, just a photo of him working on the engine. He hesitated but agreed. Vanessa posted it later that night. The caption was simple: "Meet Kofi Mensah." He fixed a 1967 Mustang like it was a paper cut. This is the kind of man we should be rooting for. Mensah Auto Solutions. The post went viral. Within 24 hours, it had 200,000 views. By the end of the week, it had 1.2 million. The phone started ringing nonstop. People drove from neighboring towns, asking for tune-ups, consultations, even just to shake his hand. A few dropped off food and business cards. One man brought his son and said, "I want him to see what a real man looks like." By week 3, Kofi was overwhelmed. He hired Javier first, then Raul, another mechanic who had walked out of Dalton's, after Rick threw a wrench across the floor and told him to speak English or go home. They worked together like they'd been waiting for this all their lives. Rick noticed. His customer base began to shrink. Reviews piled up online, negative ones. Word spread. Kofi wasn't just another garage. He was the garage. One afternoon, the doorbell at Mensah Auto Solutions rang louder than usual. Rick walked in. His boots slammed against the concrete floor. The room quieted. Raul paused mid-task. Kofi stood from behind the desk and met him halfway. "You've got a lot of nerve," Rick growled. "Stealing my guys, undercutting my prices, posting about me behind my back." Kofi folded his arms. "I haven't mentioned your name once. Don't act like this is just business. You planned this." Kofi shook his head. "No, you planned it the day you mocked my accent in front of everyone. The day you made jokes instead of space. I just responded the only way I knew how, with work." Rick stepped closer. "You think you're better than me now?" Kofi didn't blink. "No, I just stopped believing I had to be less than you to survive." Rick's face tightened. He looked around, at the spotless floor, the neatly labeled tool racks, the new lift, at the 2 mechanics who used to take orders from him but now looked at Kofi like a captain. "You'll crash," Rick said under his breath. "This won't last." Kofi turned, walked to his desk, and pulled out a folder. He handed Rick a printed page. It was a purchase offer. "Your building's on the market," Kofi said calmly. "I checked the deed. I made a bid." Rick stared at the number. His face dropped. "You can't afford this. I can now." Rick threw the paper on the ground and stormed out without another word. Javier let out a low whistle. Raul muttered, "Dios mío." Kofi said nothing. He walked over, picked up the offer sheet, folded it neatly, and returned it to the folder. His hands were steady. He was not angry. He was ready. 3 weeks later, the deal closed. The lawyer called Kofi at 3:17 p.m. on a Thursday. Rick had accepted the offer, grudgingly, bitterly, but with no other options. Business had dried up, bills were mounting, and the reputation of Dalton Auto Works had crumbled. The irony wasn't lost on Kofi. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He simply walked into the bank, signed the papers, and walked out as the new owner of the building that once held his silence hostage. That night, he stood in front of the faded Dalton Auto Works sign for the last time. It hung crooked, the A chipped, the white background stained from years of neglect. He reached up and unscrewed it himself, bolt by bolt. The next morning, a new sign was hoisted into place, Mensa and Comer Auto Garage, and beneath it, in clean, bold letters, accent or not, we understand quality. People gathered to watch. Some brought coffee, some brought kids, some brought apologies they didn't quite know how to say. Vanessa was there too, standing off to the side, eyes shining. When the final bolt locked into place, the crowd clapped. Not wildly, but earnestly. Not just for the shop, but for what it meant. Inside, the shop had changed too. The walls were painted white and blue, the floor freshly sealed, the tools labeled in English and Spanish. A small waiting area had been added with used furniture Kofi bought at auction, and a bookshelf stocked with car manuals and children's books. He kept one wall bare, not for lack of money, but for something bigger. By the end of the first month, business was steady. By the end of the third, they were booked 2 weeks out. One afternoon, a boy came in with his father. The father needed a tire patch. The boy walked over to the bare wall and stared at it. "Why is this one empty?" he asked. Kofi smiled. "That wall is waiting for the next chapter." The boy tilted his head. "What kind of chapter?" Kofi crouched beside him. "The kind we get to write ourselves." A week later, the boy returned with a painting, messy, bright, full of streaks and stars. Kofi hung it on the wall, no frame, just thumbtacks. That painting stayed there for years. Rick, meanwhile, left town. No one knew where he went. No one asked. His name faded, but the echo of his legacy remained. A cautionary tale told in hushed tones. People remembered the way he mocked others. They remembered how he underestimated a man because of how he spoke. They remembered how that same man ended up owning the very building Rick once ruled like a king. Javier and Raul both became managers at the new shop. Kofi trained 2 apprentices, both young black men who had struggled to get interviews elsewhere. Vanessa stopped by every month with receipts, spreadsheets, and 2 coffees. "I knew you'd do it," she said one morning. "I did it because someone gave me the space to believe I could." She nodded. "Sometimes that's all it takes." One evening after closing, Kofi stayed late. He pulled out his old journal from Ghana, the one he carried on the plane, the one that held a list of goals written in youthful, idealistic handwriting. He flipped to the final page. One by one, he crossed the lines off. "Open my own business, employ others, be respected, take care of mama, never forget who I am," he added a 6th line. "Teach others how to rise," and underlined it twice. That night, he locked up, stepped outside, and looked up at the sign glowing under the streetlight. Mensa and Comer's Auto Garage. The hum of traffic buzzed in the distance, but for the first time in a long time, all Kofi heard was peace. Not quiet, peace. The kind earned, the kind built, the kind spoken in any accent and understood everywhere. Months passed. The buzz of excitement around Mensa and Koa Auto Garage settled into something deeper. Trust. Customers no longer came just for car repairs. They came because they felt seen, welcomed, respected. The waiting room now held a corkboard filled with thank you notes, hand-drawn sketches from local school kids, and business cards from people Kofi had helped along the way. Rick was gone. Quietly. No farewell, no warning. Just one day, the Dalton name vanished from town records. His shop's legacy, once tied to mockery and exclusion, now stood reborn under a name that honored integrity. Kofi didn't celebrate Rick's exit. He didn't need to. He had built something better, not just a business, but a mirror of what community could look like when inclusion replaced ego. He started small, inviting a few teens from the neighborhood to sweep the floors or observe under the hood. But before long, he partnered with the local high school to launch a paid internship program. Kids who had once been told they'd never succeed found themselves learning how to rebuild engines, fix transmissions, and speak confidently with customers. "You don't have to change who you are to do great work," Kofi told them. "You just have to believe that your hands, your ideas, your story, all of it matters." Former customers from Dalton Auto Works, some of whom had once ignored him or laughed at Rick's jokes, now left glowing reviews. They spoke of professionalism, of kindness, of a garage that listened instead of judged. One older man, after his fourth visit, shook Kofi's hand and whispered, "I used to think it was just about fixing cars. You're fixing something bigger." But Kofi's impact didn't stop at the garage door. Every month he sent money home to Ghana, not just to support his family, but to build something lasting. Brick by brick, he funded the construction of a vocational school in his hometown, a place where kids like he once was could learn trades, find dignity and skill, and dream without borders. His sister called one evening, holding back tears. "They've already filled the first classroom," she said. "They named the building after you." Kofi sat at his desk long after the call ended, journal open, staring at the first goal he had ever written. Open my own business. A lot had changed since that day, but his heart had stayed steady, and now, as he turned off the lights and locked up for the night, he stood under the sign that bore his name and whispered, not out of pride, but peace. They mocked the way I spoke, thinking that made me less. But words are just wind. It's action that speaks loudest. I didn't come here to be tolerated. I came here to build. And now, I own the place where they laughed.